When things go wrong and will not come right, though you do the best you can. When life looks black as the hours of night, a pint of plain is your only man. Of course, the pint of plain is a thing of the past in Dublin this many a year. But that's a good Dublin poem by Flann O'Brien, and that's good Dublin porter. It used to be popularly held that Guinness was made from Liffey water. Well, all I can say is that there should be a brave man who would touch a drink that was anywhere near the Liffey nowadays. The Liffey, of course, is the great divider, splitting the city between north and south. I know both north and south side very well, of course, being a north sider by birth and a south sider by qualification of residence. Across the Liffey from the Guinness Brewery is the forecourts, where the anti-treaty forces dug in 1922. During the attack on the building, a young man up from the country, a boy of 17 or 18, was seen going up the stairs carrying the Chancellor's large wig. "Hey, where are you going with that?" says the CO. And the boy says, "I'm only going to take the kettle off the fire." Wolfe Tone was one of the organisers of the Great Rebellion in 1798. He was a Dublin man himself. He was born behind the forecourts in what is now called Wolfe Tone Street. He was captured during the rebellion and was brought to Dublin and sentenced to death. On his last night in prison, he was mysteriously found dying. Some say his jailers had tried to kill him. Some say he committed suicide rather than face the indignity for a soldier of hanging. He died that night anyway, and he was waked near where he was born, in the Corn Market. Although he is held in the utmost affection by every Irishman, the clergy have always been against him. And I remember some bishop referring to him as recently as 1934 or so as the cutthroat Tone. Further on down the quay from the forecourt, you come to the Metal Bridge, or as it is sometimes called, the Halfpenny Bridge. It's known as the Metal Bridge for the very obvious and un-Irish reason that it's made of metal. But in my father's day, it was better known as the Halfpenny Bridge because you had to pay a halfpenny to cross it. And then there is Bachelor's Walk, of course, with all the auction rooms and second-hand bookstalls. That part of the quay was made famous by James Joyce in his book Ulysses. Bachelor's Walk ends at O'Connell Bridge, where British troops fired on the people of Dublin in 1914. Not far away from the bridge is the General Post Office, which was the headquarters of the 1916 Rising. The story of the Rising is too well known now, God knows, to go into it all again, but during that week, an aunt of mine went down to the GPO to look for her husband, who was in there fighting. There was shells from a gunboat on the Liffey falling all around the place, and my aunt was asked with some urgency to go away. She refused to go away and kept demanding to see her husband, who finally came to a sandbagged window and roared, "Go away, Maggie!" And she shouted back, "I only wanted to know if you were going to your work in the morning." A couple of miles or so from the General Post Office is the Phoenix Park, and this is one of the largest national parks in Europe. If you could imagine all the parks in central London, from Kensington Gardens up to Hampstead Heath put together, you'd have some idea about its size. The park is full of statues, mainly to British generals, and the IRA spent a good deal of their time in the 20s and the 30s trying to blow them up. A harmless enough occupation, and a bit like they're sentencing me to death at one time in my absence. I sent them back a polite note saying that they could shoot me in my absence also. It was in the park that Lord Cavendish and Mr. Burke, both British government officials, were killed in 1882 by the Invincibles. The Invincibles were an extreme wing of the Fenians. I can't say that I ever felt much sorrow about the killing, for after all, Cavendish and Burke were imperialist agents in a country which hated them and didn't want them. It happened in the Phoenix Park, all in the month of May. Lord Cavendish and Burke came out for to see the polo play. James Carey gave the signal and his handkerchief he waved. Then he gave full information against our Fenian blades. There's a bit of life's irony in the fact that on the same side of the Liffey where the President of Ireland, the American Ambassador and the Apostolic Nuncio live are also the slums of North Dublin, where I was born, less than an ass's roar from Nelson's Pillar. I came from the same area as Sean O'Casey, about whom I don't intend to say anything, for the simple reason that it would be like praising the lakes of Killarney, a piece of impertinence. At the time I was young, this area was pretty bad, but that's one thing I must give the government credit for. They built lovely flats for the people. Mind you, it was pretty bad while it lasted. I was born in a Georgian house that had gone to rack and ruin as a tenement, so I should know. It's been knocked down since, but without any remorse on my part. Lovely garden estates the government built when they were clearing the slums, but somehow the people hated leaving where they had reared their children. They had a social status in their way in those slums that were, well, it was destroyed altogether when they were shifted out to the suburbs of Crumlin and Kimmage and set down in terraced houses mixing with God knows what muck from Irishtown and Ringsend and the Liberties and other parts south of the Liffey. I remember when we got our notice to get moving, hearing one old one moaning to me mother, "Oh, Mrs. Being, Jewel and darling, don't go out to Kimmage, that's where they ate their young." 4 miles away it was, no more, where this cannibalism took place. The north side also prides itself on the Customs House, which is a remarkable building, though to tell you the truth, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about architecture. The Customs House, as far as I'm concerned, is notable mainly for the fact that it was there I used to get false birth certificates in order to get false passports. It was burned by the volunteers in 1921. And that's what brought British administration in Ireland finally to a standstill, because all local government records were housed there. Across the Liffey is the area generally referred to as the South Side, which prides itself on its government buildings, some well-kept Georgian squares, and the old bastion of British rule in Ireland, Dublin Castle, in the dungeons of which so many died. Nearby there is Christ Church Cathedral and St. Patrick's Cathedral, where Dean Swift is buried. He was always a great defender of the Dublin poor. The two cathedrals, of course, belong to that 5% of the Irish population which is of the Protestant persuasion. I myself am a bad Catholic. I'm not at all a religious man when I'm in me health, but I'm very religious when I'm sick. Did you ever hear the story of Danny Crow that went to visit the Pope? He didn't kiss the Pope's ring. He grabbed him by the hand and he shook it heartily and he said, "Jesus, Holy Father, there isn't a man in Limerick wouldn't go to hell for you." Which brings my mind back to a piece of graffiti, this particular one from Belfast. There was this usual slogan, "No Pope here," but some wag had added, "Not even 30,000 feet up," this being a reference to the Pope's visit to a far-off country, his aircraft passing over Ireland. The Dublin graffiti, though, are by far the best. And one memorable piece of verse from a gents' toilet in the city reads thus: "You pull the chain and in a jiffy your shit is floating down the Liffey." And down the Liffey, incidentally, are the docks, the last station for the emigrant, and the first grimy look of Dublin for the returning Irishman. I arrived back here after having spent 3 years in an English borstal. I stood on deck and looked at the sun struggling up over the hills and the city all around the bay. And I will make my journey, if life and health but stand, unto that pleasant country, that fresh and fragrant strand, and leave your boasted braveries, your wealth and high command, for the fair hills of Holy Ireland. There they were, as if I'd never left them, in their sweet and stately order round the bay. Braehead, the Sugarloaf, the Two Rock, the Three Rock, Kipure, the king of them all, rising his threatening head behind and over their shoulders till they sloped down to the city. I counted the spires, from Rathmines' fat dome on one side to St. George's spire on the north, and in the centre, Christ Church. Among the smaller ones, just on the docks, I could pick out, even in the haze of the morning, the ones I knew best: St. Laurence O'Toole's and St. Barnabas. I had them all counted present and correct, and the framing circle of the road along the edge of the bay, Dunleary, Blackrock, Sandymount Tower, Rings End, and the city. And then the other half circle, Fairview, Marino, Clontarf, Rahaney, Kilbarrack, Baldoyle, to the height of Howth-Head. I was brought up in a literary city, the city of Yeats and Wilde and Shaw and Sean O'Casey, and I'm proud of it, which is all very well in a literary way, but when it comes to ordinary humanity, it's only the working class that binds me to this town. They're the only real people here. The middle class put years on me. Since the changeover in 1922, when they got well down to the porridge pot, there was no holding them. It started off with top hats and white ties and getting into the gentry, and then to chatting about the servant problem with the Anglo-Irish horse Protestants, who were at least reared to it. When Yeats used the phrase "great hatred, little room," he was referring to the so-called upper and middle classes. Joyce called the same crowd the centre of paralysis. The south side was the fashionable part of Dublin, and in those days also for Dublin's literary world. And the most famous of Dublin's Georgian squares is Merrion Square, where Yeats, Wilde and Shaw lived at the same time, if only for a short period. My mother was a maid in the house owned by Maud Gon MacBride, and Yeats used to visit the house, which was in St. Stephen's Green. My mother told me that at lunch, where she often served Yeats, he was absolutely impervious to what he ate, as he didn't know what he was eating half the time. He absent-mindedly would put sugar in the soup and salt in the coffee and all sorts of peculiar things like that. The one dislike he had in the way of food was parsnips. Once he was served parsnips by mistake, and he remarked, "This is a very peculiar pudding." Oscar Wilde, too, lived and worked for a while in a Georgian house in Merrion Square. I had a poem published in Irish in the Irish Times in 1949. It was about the death of Oscar Wilde in Paris. It was highly praised by the local mandarins. But later on in the week, it was viciously attacked in a letter as being brutal and ugly. Jesus help me with, didn't I think I was a great man altogether, that complete strangers would go to the trouble of abusing me. But I learned afterwards that the letter was written by somebody who took exception to me on purely personal grounds. Well, you might say racial and social grounds, because they thought it was a disgrace that the likes of me should be seen in print at all. Except, of course, it was in the criminal intelligence. Not far away from this famous square runs the Grand Canal, much eulogised by a notable contemporary of mine, the poet Patrick Kavanagh, who once admitted regarding my good self, "I have been friendly with him, hoping that I would be free from the horror of his acquaintanceship." At one time, when Kavanagh went back to his native Monaghan for holidays, I offered to paint his flat, me being a house painter by trade. I painted it all right, jet black all over. We had a famous falling out on the head of a court case in which he sued the Leader magazine. The details are neither here nor there, and anyway a bit beyond the grasp of a poor Jackeen the likes of me. But to be honest with you, I have always had a pathological horror of country people ever since childhood. Oh, commemorate me where there is water. Oh well, everyone to his own fancy, as the old one said when she kissed the ass. The Grand Canal runs towards the bay and Sandymount Strand, which is one of the places of pilgrimage, especially for American tourists, because it was here Joyce used to walk, looking out over the snot-green water of Dublin Bay. And here is my poem, thanks to James Joyce. Here in the Rue Saint-André des Arts, in an Arab tavern, pissed. For a studious Frenchman I construe you, ex-GIs and a Russian, pissed. All of those things you penned I praise, while in France I swill Pernod in return. Proud of you as a writer we are, and grateful for the Calvados we owe to you. If you were me and I were you, leaving Les Halles, holding all this cognac on a full belly, bawling, you'd write a verse or two in my praise. In Mount Georgia, one Monday morning, high upon the gallows tree, Calvin Barry gave was a lad of 18 summers, yet there's no one can deny that as he walked to death that morning, he proudly held his head on high. I grew up in a Republican home and was more or less a rebel by the time I'd learned to read. At the age of 8, I joined the Fianna, the youth organisation with the object to train Fianna boys in the revolutionary tradition until the day when we'd be old enough to join. The members of the Fianna must know Irish Republican history as well as the Morse code, marching and foot drill. When I was 15, I published a poem in a Republican weekly, The United Irishman. It was entitled A Young Fianna Boy's Answer. Oh God, why do they mock me with paper freedom under England's crown, even while they forge another link to bind me, another traitor's chain to drag me down. But God is good. My lovers are not vanquished. Their arms are strong as steel. Their hearts are true. Another day will see my armies marching to strike another blow for Roisin Dew. Now better man. At the age of 16, I became a member of the IRA, and after a courier's mission to London, I was sent to Killiney Castle outside Dublin, which was a camp for special training for IRA recruits. But my IRA activities did cost me 6 years in jail, 2 years in an English borstal and 4 years in Irish prisons. A hungry feeling came o'er me stealing as the mice they were squealing in my prison cell, and the old triangle went jingle jangle along the banks of the Royal Canal to begin the morning. The warders bawling, get up, you bowsy, and clean out your cell, while the old triangle goes jingle jangle along the banks of the Royal Canal. Stand to a cell door, rasped the warder. Get a move on yourself there. His gills wattled in anger as he pushed me towards the cell door, handing me my kit. He opened the door and my Jesus, my heart fell into my boots. It was like the Black Hole of Calcutta, only the walls were white. Or they were whitewashed, I should say, otherwise you wouldn't have seen them at all, as half the window was below the level of the ground. In the dim light, I could see the usual inscriptions on the walls. There were hearts and flowers and names that I couldn't decipher too well. The warder slammed the door behind me, lifted the cover over the little spy hole in the door, knocked it down again, and was off across the corridor, his footsteps fading as he did so. I walked the 10 paces down from the door to the apology for the window and reflected in misery the amount of exercise I'd get if I did this every day of the 14-year stretch. After 1 year at the Joy, I was transferred to the military prison at Arbour Hill. I wasn't out of my mind about the transaction because I had heard that the cells there were only about 16 feet by 8 and that a prisoner in solitary confinement could only walk 5 paces each way. But I also knew that beyond the boundary walls of the exercise yard were the graves of the men who had been executed in Easter week 1916. Thomas J. Clark, Padraig H. Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh and the rest. I knew their names and all belonging to them as well as I knew me own. 'Twas in Kilmainham prison yard our 15 martyrs died, and cold and still in Arbour Hill they are lying side by side. But we will yet pay back the debt, for the spirit is still alive in the men who stood through fire and blood with Convict 95. Convict 95 was Eamon de Valera, who was serving a life sentence in Dartmoor after 1916. But sure, wasn't I in the Joy myself often enough to be President of Ireland 3 times over? When I knew I was going to be free again, I knew I was going to be free again to hunger and to poverty and to no kind of pyjamas, not even Free State Army ones. But I knew also I was free to the lights of my native city, which are very large and welcoming and... Oh, I don't know. I was young at the time, for Jesus' sake. Winter didn't bother me as it does now. It's always winter in Dublin. 'Twas on an August morning, all in the dawning hours, I went to take the warming air, all in the mouth of flowers, and there I saw a maiden, and mournful was her cry. Oh, what will mend my aching heart? I've lost my laughing boy.
Time, gentlemen, please. Time, please. Come along now, boys. Time up, time, please.